February 13th, 2014, Megan Coe interviews Margaret Randall. Hi, Margaret. So I have some questions today for our interview. And the first one I have for you is, what connections do you see between poetry and social activism? As both a poet and an activist.
Well, that's a great question. It's hard to answer, though. I mean, you know, I sort of resist the idea as a poet. And I should say, to begin with, that I consider myself a poet above anything else that I do. I write essays, I am an activist, I'm a photographer, and I've done many things in my life. But for me, poetry is really who I am more than what I do. So it's the way I identify myself. And as a poet, I really resist sort of the idea that poetry should be activism or should be anything. It should be good. If it's not good, it's worthless. And, you know, in this country, there's a particular history, especially for those of my generation, around the idea that, well, when I was coming up as a young poet in the 50s and 60s, especially in the 50s, with the residue of McCarthyism, there was this idea that poetry could not be socially committed, could not be political. The idea of political poetry was anathema to the academy, especially. And so growing up in that atmosphere, it was confusing to me because I was beginning to have political ideas. I was beginning to think about justice. I was beginning to try to understand how I saw the world. And all of that is political. You know, when I say political, I don't mean partisan. I mean something much broader. So, fortunately for me, because of a series of circumstances, I moved to Latin America in 1961. Here in the United States in the 60s, poets broke through that barrier. I mean, you had the Beat Generation, you had the Black Mountain poets, you had, you know, many schools of poets who just simply refused to accept the idea that one could not write about what one was passionate about. And if you were passionate about issues of social justice, that would creep into your work, as well it should. But I moved to Latin America, as I say, and I lived first in Mexico for 8 years, and my then husband and I founded a bilingual magazine, poetry magazine, cultural magazine, that became highly political. And I think the contact that I had through that magazine, especially with poets from all over the continent, many of whom were guerrilla fighters, some of them were Catholic priests, some of them were union organizers, some of them were students, young poets, old poets, but they all wrote passionately about what meant most to them. And of course, the political turmoil of those years was very much evident in their poetry. And so I somehow managed to escape that limitation that existed in the States during the 50s, especially, as I say, during the McCarthy era, and sort of free myself of that contradiction. But on the other hand, I resist the idea of a political poem. You know, people talk about political poetry, and that just has never made sense to me. And perhaps because everything is political today. Love, war, hunger, beauty. I mean, if what you mean by political is a point of view, everything has a point of view. And in fact, the absence of a point of view is also political in a negative sense. I mean, I can remember all those poems from my youth during that period of the McCarthy era and immediately after, poems about dewdrops on rose petals and so forth. You know, that was supposed to be the poetry that one wrote. So When you ask me what I think about poetry as social activism, that was the question, right?
What connections do you see
What
between the
connections
two?
there is? None really in particular, except that if you are an activist, I mean, we write out of who we are. Everyone writes out of who they are. And so if some form of political activism is important to you, then that's going to come into your poetry. And so in that sense, they would be connected, but not necessarily.
Okay, thank you. And what exactly about your writing do you feel incited the government enough to deport you in 1984?
I think there were many things. I think the fact that I transcribed women's voices. First of all, the voices of ordinary people in Latin America who were living lives often damaged by U.S. government policy. They were talking about what the U.S. infringement on their lives meant to them. Those kinds of things weren't coming out in the newspapers here at the time, or much of anywhere else. And so the fact that I gave voice to those women, and some men, but essentially women, I think was angered the government. The exact wording of the first judge who actually ordered me deported was, her writings go against the good order and happiness of the United States. That was the quote. And you know, when you think of that, it's pretty laughable, but it's also very serious, because what it means is the only thing that upholds the good order and happiness of the United States is to accept hook, line, and sinker the policies, the attitudes, the ideas that a government puts forth, and that's absurd. I mean, it absolutely goes against the idea that we live in a free country where there's freedom of speech, of freedom of dissent, and so forth. So I think, you know, writing, giving voice to women, writing about places like Cuba and Nicaragua, both of which I lived in for a number of years each, places that were not high on the list of U.S. government's favorites at the time, and about which our government didn't want people really to know, you know, what was going on there and how people lived and how they thought. I wrote a lot of material that broke with the stereotypes that were being put forth here. So I think that all of that was part of it. I also think that just as a woman, refusing to say I'm sorry was a big thorn in their side, because on a number of occasions during the 5 years of my case, I was sort of given that opportunity surreptitiously to, you know, say, I'm really sorry I said this, or I wrote this, I won't do it again, you know, the kind of thing that is often expected of women even today. And I just refused to give the right answer to that. You know, I just, and at times it was hard, because when some of the my writings that were used against me were things I had written when I was 20, 24, 25. At the time of my case, I was 47, 50. And of course you change. And I mean, my core values hadn't changed, but certainly I wouldn't have written some of the things at 47 that I wrote at 27 or 20. But to me, it was important not to say, oh, I'm sorry I wrote that, you know, because I think for me it became very important to defend the right even to be wrong, you know, but just defend that right of dissent, of freedom of speech and so forth.
Was there a lot of news or media coverage of your deportation that did the opposite of what the government wanted then, by giving voice to what was going on?
There was a huge amount of publicity around the case. It would kind of die down from time to time. Each time I went to trial or something happened, a decision was made in the case, it would come up again and it would be in all the papers, and I would be invited to be on Nightline and Good Morning America and those kinds of shows. So, it sort of went up and down. The publicity was of two types. It was a great many wonderful people came out in my defense, writers and academics and scholars and young people and, all kinds of people from all over. And great poets read for the case, great singers sang for the case. Liz was involved in a defense committee in Buffalo, and I mean, there were defense committees all over the country. So there were a great many people who provided a kind of publicity that was very positive, and that also, aside from supporting me as an individual, supported the right of people with different ideas to be in this country, to converse with people in this country, and also to challenge the prevailing immigration law of the time, which was really terrible and continues to be terrible, although it's changed somewhat. So there was that kind of publicity. And then, of course, there was the other kind of publicity. There were the Young Republican Club and the, this group or that group that used my case as a way to put forth their ideas and their propaganda, and some very ugly things were said and so forth. But so there were both kinds of publicity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was your proudest or scariest moment as an activist?
I don't know that I've had I think what makes me proudest as an activist is having had the good fortune on the one hand and the courage on the other to be in certain places where important things were happening. The early years of the Cuban Revolution, the Mexican student movement of 1968, the early years of the Sandinista Revolution, North Vietnam just before the end of the American War in Vietnam. I'm proud and also grateful that I've been able to be in those places at that time and learn from people who, on the ground, who were really making important social changes. So rather than, I can't think of one particular moment that makes me proud, but that these days, especially when I feel often very depressed about the state of the nation and the world and global warming and how little attention people with power to make change seem to be paying the issues that I feel are life and death issues. In those moments, I remind myself that I'm of a generation that did participate, and I'm still very proud of the issues that we struggled around. And you asked me about frightening. I mean, I've had many, many, many moments that were frightening, that were extremely frightening. When I had to go underground in Mexico, when I had to send my 4 very small children out of the country to protect them. Even during my case, here in this country, I had a few moments like being beaten up in my office at the University of New Mexico by someone who didn't agree with my political views. Those moments were momentarily frightening. The fear didn't last, but when I look back on them, I think, yeah, those weren't so much fun.
No. Okay, well, I have a lighter question for you then. Who do you love to read?
poetry. I love reading poetry, and lately I've been rereading an Argentine poet and very dear friend who died a couple of weeks ago, Juan Elman. So I've been rereading his work in Spanish and also English translations, and trying to figure out why the translators chose whatever route they chose to render his work in English. I don't read many novels, although I have some favorite novels, and I love novels when they sort of grab me. I'm kind of impatient with novels. I read a lot of essays. I read a lot of material that's either scientific or geography, history, anthropology. I love, one of my favorite books is Breaking the Mayan Code by Michael Coe. I read it at least twice a year.
Wow.
I love reading memoir and really good biographies, and I've read some wonderful biographies lately. A wonderful new biography of Thelonious Monk, the jazz musician. A wonderful biography of Marion Moore, the poet. I like reading oral history. So I read, and usually when I'm working on a writing project, I'm voraciously reading everything I can get my hands on about whatever the person or topic is that I'm writing about. So I do a lot of that kind of reading too.
Are you into a new project right now?
Yes.
Do you want to talk about it a little? Or?
I'm just at the beginning of it. I'm going to be presenting a book tomorrow night at Antigone's about Che Guevara, and it's not a biography. It's I guess I would maybe immodestly call it an attempt to create a new kind of genre that combines poetry and feminist analysis and sort of impressionistic history. So that book was a kind of a breakthrough for me in that respect. And there's a chapter in that book called Che and Ide, which is about Che Guevara and a woman who was prominent in the Cuban Revolution named Ide Santa Maria. And I knew Ide, we were friends, and she was an extraordinary woman, and I've always wanted to write about her. I have actually written a number of short pieces about her. I wrote an essay about her, which appears in a new book of essays I have just out a few months ago, called More Than Things. I've written poetry about her. And I've always kind of thought, I'd really love to write a full-length book about her. But as the years went by, I thought I'm too old. I don't have the energy to do the kind of research and travel and so forth that would require. And about a month ago, I guess, or a month and a half ago, I realized I'm just going to go for it. So I'm at the beginning of that project right now.
Great. And I have one last question for you today, and that is, what advice do you have for gender and women's studies students? For all our students who will be watching this video.
Advice? Well, I don't really like giving advice to young people because I think that you're, in a way, things come full circle, and I think in a very important way you're our teachers now. I mean, we were your teachers for years, and now you teach us through your way of seeing the world, a very contemporary way, very engaged with what's going on now, not what was going on when I was young. So I don't really have any advice except just push yourself and go where your energy and heart lead you. When you're excited by something, when you're passionate about it, find out everything you can find out about it, and that's the way you open new roads. So I think that I don't know if that's advice. I mean, that just seems sort of logical to me, but...
Oh, you'd be surprised. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
You're welcome.
So, Margaret, can you tell us a little bit about the Women's Plaza of Honor?
Well, you all know a lot more about it than I do because you live here in Tucson and are on this campus where the Women's Plaza of Honor exists. I'm just a visitor to it, and a very grateful visitor, and a jealous visitor. We don't have anything like that in Albuquerque, and I venture to say that there aren't very many places in the world that have such a place. I found out about the Women's Plaza of Honor before it became a reality because Liz Kennedy and I are good friends, old friends. And when Liz first came here, how many years ago? Maybe
98 I came.
98. I remember Liz saying one of the first things that, she was sort of thinking about how she would make her contribution to women's studies and to the university. And one of the things that she mentioned that that really caught my attention was this idea that she had seen someplace else, something similar, to make a Women's Plaza of Honor on the campus of the University of Arizona. And I remember that my first internal response, I didn't say it out loud to Liz, was, another one of Liz's wonderful, extraordinary ideas, which will probably never happen because it will take, an infinite amount of work and contributions from an entire community and a campus. And but what a great idea if it could materialize. And then I began to hear little snippets of the initial history of how people were getting together here on campus and in the broader community and actually making it happen, and creating committees and subcommittees and raising the money and getting a wonderful a female-run architectural office and landscapers and so forth and so on, all to come together and make this a reality, to honor women. And it's just it's a truism, but it bears repeating that women's contributions throughout history and around the world are so undervalued and in all the fields, and it's still a struggle. And so to think of a place, a physical place that would be beautiful, that would be serene, but that would be exciting at the same time, and that would honor all these women and have their biographies and their photographs in a database easily accessible, that would teach the visitors about these women's lives, and that they would be famous women and ordinary women, and women who everyone knew about, and women who no one knew, but perhaps their husband or sister or lover or daughter who wanted to honor them in this way. And how incredibly democratic it became. You could buy an arch for, $100,000, something like that, and you could buy a brick for $250. So it was really open to people of all means to make that honoring gesture, and it would be a place where people could unpack their brown bag lunch or just sit and feel peaceful and so forth and so on. So as I began to watch it over the years come into being, and I would hear from Liz about how the organization, if it was going, and then occasionally my partner and I would come to Tucson for one reason or another, and we began to see it take shape actually physically. It just excited my imagination in a way that few things have. So a couple of years ago, I decided that I really wanted to contribute to it also in some way, and I began to buy a few, little leaves or the least expensive kind of brick. The first person I honored was a child here in Tucson who I think that was the first.
First person was Comandante.
That's true. Yeah, the first person I thought, well, who do I know in Arizona? And then I realized that the kinds of borders that fictitiously divide us in this world, women from men and known people from unknown people and people of different nationalities, shouldn't really operate in a place like this plaza. That the border, the arbitrary border between Mexico and the United States should not exist in a place like this. So I decided to honor a woman commander of the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico, Comandante Ramona, who had recently died of lung cancer. So that was my first brick, I guess. And then I honored this young daughter of some friends of ours who was 7 at the time, and she lives here in Tucson. And she's a very special child, and so I thought that would be a stimulus to her. And then I remember that I wanted to honor somebody who was, when Tucson's unified school district began banning books and closing down the Mexican-American studies here at the public school level, I realized that this would be a great opportunity to honor one of the young women who was a leader in that move against that. And so I did that. And then I began to think of some of my mentors, like Agnes Medley or Elaine de Kooning, and I honored them. And so, whenever I can, I feel really good about. One of the people I've been most thrilled to honor is a woman here in Arizona who is one of the first women who got a license to row people down Grand Canyon, down the river, the whole river.
Right.
Fabulous woman. Who's now in her early 60s, and you can imagine in that male world how difficult it was to get a license and begin to row as a woman. So for me, it's been a very joyous thing to be able to, every once in a while, if I have a few $100 extra to contribute to it, and then just to see it grow and to see it succeed and to see it be so much more than I think anyone dreamed of it being to begin with, has been very exciting, because it's such an example of diverse people coming together, not always agreeing about the goals and the different sort of operational elements in the plaza, but working it out democratically, coming to consensus and making it happen. It's a very, very unique place, and I just wish that we had more places like that in the world.
Mm-hmm. We have Liz Kennedy here with us, who started the idea of the plaza. Liz, do you want to add anything to what Margaret has said about the Women's Plaza of Honor?
Really, I think Margaret her excitement about the plaza is a model way for us to think about it, and the way she grounds it in the fact of people coming together democratically to create this and to keep that foremost in our minds about what it means to honor women. So I think Margaret's an excellent spokesperson for the plaza.
Mm-hmm, yes, she is.
She is.
Yeah.
I hope that it will inspire other people to think about it in similar ways, which I think is the right way to think about it. It's a more positive way to think about it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thrilled.
Thank you. And thank you for being here with us today.
You're welcome, Megan.